Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April edition of the Staff Wellness and Health Booster Sessions. Our topic this month is post-traumatic growth, and this is part two of a two-part series on the topic. My name is Chad Saxon, Communication Specialist with Shared Health, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our presenter today is Carmel Watson, Organizational Assistant Specialist with Blue Cross Manitoba. We'll get to Carmel and her presentation in a few seconds, but we just go over a couple other items first. So as we all know, this has been a time of great change in our world. We've been forced to adjust how we conduct ourselves in the workplace, our homes, and with our social connections. These changes can sometimes feel overwhelming. To support the mental health and wellness of health system workers and the public, mental health and to support the mental health and wellness of health system workers and the public, Mental Health and Addictions Shared Health has brought together skilled trainers from across the province to facilitate several booster sessions. During this two-part series, you'll be introduced to the concept of post-traumatic growth. This is not merely a bouncing back to the level of functioning prior to a trauma, but rather a sense of growth beyond pre-trauma functioning. In part one, we learned about post-traumatic growth and the stress response, and in today's session, Carmel will identify ways you can enhance this growth and nurture the changes you've experienced. Following the presentation, we will have a few minutes for questions. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be made available as a streaming video on demand on Shared Health's mental health resources page and also on the health providers page. And I'll put a link for that in the chat so you can keep an eye out for that. So with that, I'll turn things over to Carmel for her presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Chad. Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining me for this session on post-traumatic growth. As already mentioned, I work for Manitoba Blue Cross, and we are very happy to be your provider for employee assistance benefits. So what that means is that through your EAP benefits, you have short-term counseling available to you and your family members. We also offer lots of other services, one of which is workshops and seminars. So today I am presenting the second half, so a shorter version of one of the seminars that we offer. And yes, I split it into two because it is quite a big topic. And so we're going to look at the second half of the session today. Hopefully things will go a little bit smoother than the last time when I had a few problems with my PowerPoint. So hopefully this will work today. Let's just see here. Okay, we're going to quickly take a look at the overall agenda for the session, again, keeping in mind that it's split into two parts. So we'll be reviewing a little bit of the first session and then primarily be discussing the second half of this today with the tips on self-care and then growth after trauma. I wanted to first review resilience, as most of us are probably a bit more familiar with this term. So resilience refers to the idea that we can bounce back after going through a challenging period. So it's the ability to recover from or adjust to misfortune or change. I thought that I would also review post-traumatic growth, just in case there's a few people that maybe weren't in that first session or just want a little bit of a reminder here. So post-traumatic growth is a concept similar to resilience, but distinct from it. So this idea, as I shared before, was developed in the 1990s by two psychologists and can be defined as positive change that occurs in the aftermath of struggling with a major life crisis or traumatic event. So this can be a wide variety of experiences, and absolutely, I mentioned in the last time, it absolutely can include the pandemic and the impacts over the last few years. So typically post-traumatic growth develops following a physical or psychological trauma that is disruptive enough to our perspectives and values that it stimulates reassessment and rebuilding of psychological and often philosophical beliefs and approach to living. So this often, it often forces people to recognize that they're not invincible, consider what they do and do not have control over, and reassess their personal and professional priorities. So maybe you've noticed that yourself over the last few years, you know, that reassessment of your personal priorities, but also your work, right? There's so much that goes into the time and energy we put into our work. And I think a lot of us still have those moments of saying, did this really happen? Did we really experience this? So some reflection on that. So again, post-traumatic growth, we're talking about a transformation, okay? A challenge to people's core beliefs that causes them to become different than they were before the event or the trauma. See here, again, just as a review, post-traumatic growth is going to look different for each person. And it will be described as a process that might result in some of these things that are listed on the slide. So a development of deeper relationships, openness to new possibilities, a greater sense of personal strength, stronger sense of spirituality, and a greater appreciation of life. So yeah, we'll look a little bit deeper into those coming up. And post-traumatic growth is a really cool concept that suggests that people can emerge from trauma or adversity having achieved positive personal growth rather than that returning to your pre-existing state. So again, often that's what resilience is, sort of bouncing back. We want to actually grow from what our experiences are. So we're going to jump right in and take a look at some of the self-care strategies, okay, that might happen when exposed to trauma, or that might be a good idea when you're exposed to trauma. Now, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of focusing on what you have control over. As I just mentioned, a lot of people felt that things really got shaken up, and we realized that we don't have a lot of control. So, when you put your energy here, you're going to boost on what you do have control. You're going to boost your mental health and resilience. And one thing that you have control over is your self-care. And there are some really great resources readily available to assist you or a family member if you're struggling. So often, and even writing a list out, right, of all of the things that are on your mind, and then circling the things that you actually have control over, and then paying attention to those things. That can really help us to put things into perspective. Take some time to digitally disconnect. So we absolutely have become so obsessed with screens that we often mindlessly scroll on our phones, or think that the only way to relax is in front of the TV, or to play a video game, as an example. And so I'm going to encourage people to consider finding other things to do that don't always involve being digitally connected. So yeah, how about going outside, playing a board game, or reading a book? There's lots of different ways that we can actually get away from the screens, and that's going to take care of our minds in so many different ways, and our eyes, and all of these different things, our attention spans. So a great strategy is to find time to digitally disconnect. Limit media intake. So this was a really important one in the height of the pandemic. So some people were watching the news nonstop. Maybe you were one of those people, and sort of constantly taking in information about the numbers of cases, or how many deaths there were with the pandemic. And I understand that people were interested in this information. They wanted to be informed. However, I do have to say, being exposed to that level, it really increases some people's anxieties. So again, I do respect that it's important for some people to need to know information. However, I also really felt it was important for people to reflect on whether or not the amount that they were taking in had a positive or a negative impact on their mental health. So I decided to keep this one on my list for self-care strategies, even though we're not at that same point, we're not reporting the same type of numbers on the news. But I really think it's important that we are paying attention, both for ourselves and for our children, how much exposure we have. So whether it is the news or social media accounts that we follow, we really want to pay attention to how this exposure makes us feel, and whether or not we're getting information from a trusted source. So, I have a lot of friends that will even pay attention to how they feel when they're following certain people, let's say on social media. And when they notice that it just doesn't feel good for them, they start to clean that up, okay? So clean up who you follow, and maybe filter in more positive things for you that make you feel good rather than make you feel bad about yourself. Or again, news sources, where are you getting that information from? Is it a trusted source? So paying attention to those things can really shift things for you and how you feel. Take time to connect with someone that gives you energy each day. So just like following different accounts, even seeing people, connecting people socially, pick and choose who makes you feel good, okay? So who gives you energy or who drains your energy? So social connection is one of the best predictors of our mental health. So this can be as simple as texting with someone or just asking somebody about their day, taking time to connect with somebody each day. And again, picking and choosing who those people are. Really, really important part of self-care. Take care of the basics, sleep, nutrition, movement. So make sure to eat some food that counts as good fuel and stay well hydrated. I've said this in other presentations of mine, if you've been in them before, that like these things are so basic and so like sometimes we discount them because it's like, yeah, I've heard it all before. I need to eat, eat healthier. I need to sleep. I need to drink water. But we don't realize how quickly these things can make a difference for us. Just drinking more water can absolutely shift the energy that you feel or the mood that you're in. Getting enough sleep, how many times do we, a good night's sleep can make a big difference, and it's very, very true. So, don't stay up. Sleep is key to processing emotions, reorganizing your thoughts, and restoring your energy. So pay attention to these things. Your breaks too. Get up, move your body. A lot of us are sitting in front of, again, screens. So schedule your breaks, take them and move your body. It's going to make a big difference on how you feel for the rest of your day. Even better yet, connect with a colleague or a neighbor if you're working from home and say, want to go for a quick 15-minute walk on our lunch break. And you're going to return to your space, your workspace, feeling more refreshed when you do things like that. Develop a routine or a schedule that works for you and your family. This was really important. I can speak for myself around the pandemic, how important having a routine was. When I felt like everything had been thrown off, I was now working from home, my kid was at home doing schooling. It felt like there was just, it was really very different. Everything was thrown off. And so right away, that's one of the things I did was I tried to find a schedule or a routine that I could still keep to. And that way I knew what was to expect. Okay, I didn't feel as disorganized or chaotic with what was going on in the world when I knew what to expect. So whether you're waking up at the same time, maybe your meals, you're eating your meals at the same time, you're getting out of the house at the same time, a game night, like again, we do pizza movie night on Friday, so we always have that to look forward to. Our minds and our bodies really crave units of time, routine, and predictable schedules. So when we're faced with challenges, routines can be one of those things that we feel, again, like we have some control over and that we can rely on and feel more grounded. So that one, we might make fun of people who are really rigid in their schedules. Sometimes there's a reason for that. I was joking with my mom about this actually, because my parents can be really quite rigid with how they do things. And yet she shared with me, this is something that actually helps them get through their day with less challenges, especially as they're getting older and maybe, it's easier to forget things. She said when things are scheduled that way and she knows what to expect, she's less likely to forget things. And there's comfort in that. Right. So again, that can be a really big one for self-care. It seems really small. And, of course, we also want some flexibility. That's important. But for some things, you might actually keep those the same and hold on to those to keep you grounded. Setting boundaries. So I already mentioned the taking the breaks. Absolutely. A lot of workplaces have moved to hybrid models. So being aware of our boundaries between our home and our work life is super important. Also boundaries around needing to take your breaks or letting people know that you're focused on self-care. And so making those changes can reflect that. So talking to people, hey, this is my focus. I'm really focused on taking care of myself. So you're going to notice that I'm not going to respond to emails after this time, or you're not going to find me at my desk during my lunch hour like you normally would, because I'm really focused on doing these things. So please respect that and don't schedule a meeting during that time, or understand that I will reply to your email at a later point. So setting boundaries, taking breaks is just one example of setting boundaries, but it can often be a big one for us at work. So lots of great ideas for self-care. I hope that you've written some of these down. Again, I can absolutely share the PowerPoint if that's helpful to share that with people. Well, let's talk about how we can achieve growth after a traumatic event. And so post-traumatic growth, it does often happen naturally, so don't necessarily need any formal intervention, but we can, however, facilitate the growth in a variety of ways. So let's go through some of these here. The first one is through education. So to move through trauma to growth, one must first get educated about what trauma is. It's often a disruption of those core belief systems that I mentioned earlier. So for example, again, before the pandemic, many of us thought that we were safe from these types of sort of diseases that endangered people in the past. We might have had the belief that bad things happen in other parts of the world, but it's not going to happen to us here in Canada. And that our social and economic systems were resilient enough to weather all storms. And what we really discovered was that none of that was true. So we now need to figure out what to do with that belief instead. When our assumptions are challenged, it's confusing and it's frightening, and it tends to produce anxious, repetitive thinking. We might ask questions like, why did this happen? Who is in control, and what should I do now? So we're forced to rethink who we are, what kinds of people surround us, what world we live in, and what future we will have. And so it can be extremely painful and challenging. Research shows, however, that it can also usher in change that will be of value. So we have to begin by learning and understanding that truth. So through education, understanding it, asking questions, this can help us facilitate growth. We can also facilitate growth through emotional regulation. So to do any sort of learning, we really have to be in the right frame of mind to do that. And that starts with managing negative emotions such as anxiety, guilt, anger, a variety of different ways, so what we can do we can do this by shifting our kind of thinking, right? So we want to shift our thinking that leads to that reflection piece. And so instead of focusing on loss, failures, uncertainties, and worst case scenarios, we're going to try and focus on recalling successes, consider best case possibilities, reflect on your own organization's resources and preparations, and then think reasonably about what you, and that might be personally or that might be professionally, what you can do. Okay, so you can regulate emotions directly by observing them as they're experienced. So again, taking a few moments, experiencing something and reflecting, sitting back and observing those experiences. Physical exercise and meditative practices such as breathing can help. I think I've, again, in other presentations, I've shared different ways to do this emotional regulation. We can also acknowledge the circumstances, acknowledge that certain circumstances continue to be both challenging and frightening, then demonstrate poise under that pressure and encourage more frequent communication so that people are less isolated and see their collective emotional strengths more clearly. So a lot of different ways to practice this emotional regulation. Again, observing, maybe specifically trying different meditative or breathing techniques, acknowledging it in some way. That kind of goes back to that name it to tame it that I shared again in another presentation. By naming, we're able to tame it and regulate our emotions. So lots of different ways to do that piece. Disclosure is another way to facilitate growth. So this is the part of the process in which you talk about what has happened and is happening. So you're going to talk about its effects, both small and broad, short and long-term, personal and professional, maybe individual and organizational, and what you're struggling with in its wake. Okay, so articulating these things helps us to make sense of the trauma and turn debilitating thoughts into more productive reflections. So this one is, you start by speaking openly about your own struggles and how you're managing the uncertainty. Then you can invite other people to tell their story as well and listen attentively as they locate their difficulties and come to terms with how their challenges and losses have affected them. This is, again, a little bit of that role modeling piece, and often I would encourage leaders to do this. So by disclosing and sharing, again, you do want to have some boundaries around this, but by being vulnerable, basically we're saying be vulnerable, share, and it gives permission for other people to do the same. And within that, there's lots of connections and growth that can happen with that. Which actually brings me to this narrative development. So It's to produce an authentic narrative about the trauma and our lives afterwards so that we can accept the chapters already written and imagine crafting the next ones in a meaningful way. So your story can be about a traumatic past that leads to a better future. When you're ready, start to shape the narrative of this trauma for yourself. So that might be the pandemic, or you might be thinking of a different traumatic event that you experienced. So, how has this experience caused you to recalibrate your priorities? What new paths or opportunities have emerged from it? So again, you can do this on all different levels. That can be your own personal experience. That can be your organization's experience. So what things have come out of this experience that we actually say, hey, this is great. And maybe even a virtual presentation like this is an example. Now we're able to share a presentation. Yes, it's not in person, and there's some benefits of in person, but there's also this benefit of like, wow, how amazing our technology has grown and more people can access support like this or information like this. So, creating that narrative around what has gone well, what are we taking away from this experience? Lastly, we can facilitate growth through service. So people do better in the aftermath of trauma if they find work that benefits others. Helping people close to them or the broader community, focusing on how you can help. And so some examples, again, during the pandemic, there was, a lovely group of people decided to get together and start sewing masks, or we had this movement towards supporting small businesses or volunteering to deliver groceries to seniors. So these are all things that lead to growth. Simply expressing gratitude and showing compassion and empathy to others can also be powerful and contribute to your growth. Now, I do want to just, on a side note, want to mention that post-traumatic growth often arises after a situation has ended. And I will admit, I'm truly unsure if we can say that the pandemic and its effects are over. I've heard some people use, post-pandemic, and I'm not really 100% sure if we are there yet. But that uncertainty may keep us from moving forward completely in our growth. However, we can still start the process and we can engage in these steps along the way. So I just wanted to mention that as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the potential growth that can happen as a result of taking the time to reflect on your experiences. One of my absolute favorite quotes is, we do not learn from our experience, we learn from reflecting on our experience. So again, you've probably heard me many times say, pause, reflect, ask yourself a few questions. So I'm going to share with some areas that you may experience growth. And again, I hope that some of the stuff that we're talking about today will allow you to reflect a little bit on your growth. So personal strengths, people are often surprised by how well they handled trauma. They're often left better equipped to tackle further challenges. So when you can reflect on like, wow, I'm actually surprised on how I handled that. And now I know that I can handle future struggles. So again, it allows us to recognize and embrace some of the personal strengths that we may not have realized beforehand. And then we can apply those to teams and to organizations. So my personal strength and my team really did well. And hey, actually the organization also did well. So groups often come through such trials with a clear picture of their collective knowledge, skills, resilience, and personal, growth potential. So new possibilities. So when new realities prevent the resumption of old habits, roles, and strategies, we absolutely were forced to adapt and innovate, right? And so again, pandemic is an example of that. We often find the courage to test new paths and to show each other that change can be embraced rather than feared. So perhaps you're initially, forced to find a new way of doing things as a result of the pandemic. However, I'm curious as to what new possibilities you might have discovered, which ones have you maintained, even though things have somewhat gone back to normal. So again, maybe there's certain things that you do now that you're like, hey, I'm glad that I was forced to discover those new possibilities and those new paths. And I'm going to keep those things, even though I no longer need to. And maybe it is like scheduling breaks and stuff like that, doing something a little bit different. Improved relationships. So these are often born out of the need to give and receive support through trying times. So trauma can help forge new relationships and make people more grateful for the ones that they already have. coming through a crisis together is a bonding experience. And I don't want to ignore the fact that some relationships also absolutely struggle during a crisis or trauma. So you're gonna, some things are going to get stronger, relationships are going to get stronger. And then some relationships we're going to recognize, that maybe we're going to see things a little bit more clearly and make changes for the good. Appreciate what we have, or start to clean up the ones, and the ones that maybe weren't so great, or maintain relationships that are healthy for us. So again, we may see things clear and improve relationships, or get rid of relationships that have not been healthy for us, because we now see it a little differently. When confronted with fear and loss, we often become better at noticing what we still have but may not have may have previously overlooked. So even something as mundane as remarking that your morning coffee tastes good, that counts, okay? Practicing mindfulness and being in the moment to appreciate the big and the little things is a wonderful area of growth. So again, you might see things more clearly. You may decide that you're gonna start to appreciate those little things. And lastly on here is spiritual growth. So this comes from reflecting on some of those big questions that are often ignored in the routine of daily life and being busy. So the challenges to core beliefs that we encounter in trauma often force people to become philosophers, to design a life that's worth living, continuing to live. So often, again, we can ask those big pictures. If we take the time to reflect on what we've been through, we may come with some spiritual growth. So these are examples of how we can grow from experiencing trauma. I really want to emphasize that this is not to minimize how challenging this has all been, or again, if you're thinking of a different trauma than the pandemic, I most definitely don't want people to think that I'm just saying, hey, just look on the bright side. What I'm hoping that you're taking from this is a hopeful message, and one that if we learn to lean on each other and explore opportunities, do that reflection during the tough times, there is still the possibility to grow and evolve. So before we wrap up the session, I would like to hear, I do think we've got a little bit of time here, but I'd like to hear what growth you've experienced after a traumatic event. So feel free to share in the chat, and Chad, maybe you can share, or simply, you can make a note for yourself. If you don't want to share in the chat, that's fine. And you can reflect on any event, whether it's the pandemic or another situation that you've been through. And if you don't feel like you have in fact experienced growth, that's okay too. My hope again is that you now know that it's possible. So yeah, let me know, what growth have you experienced after a traumatic event?
Okay, if anyone would like to provide some of their experiences, we can enter into the question section, and we'll bring them out, read them out.
Mm-hmm.
I think I know one area that certainly I've heard people discuss is sort of the resilience of going through what everybody's gone through, and just kind of that sense of, well, if we can get through this, we can probably get through anything.
Right.
Is that, I can imagine though that might be a bit of a double-edged sword in a sense, because I mean, it's great that we're building that resilience, but does that also maybe sort of maybe take away from the experience as well, and sort of some of the I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it can go both ways, right? Depending, and also depending on the day, right? One day you might be like, wow, I can't believe we went through that. Like, that's amazing that we were resilient to do that. And then other days it might be like, huh, like it probably depends on the day, the person, the mood.
Yeah, I'm not explaining it entirely clear, but I just like, I have noticed where you're kind of like, it's almost, it's too bad people obviously had to go through that, and then there's sort of it's maybe that idea of building up that resilience is kind of almost a defense mechanism, I think, and maybe in a bit of a sense as well. We had one comment. I learned I'm a more patient person than I gave myself credit for, and I can certainly understand that. A lot of patience was required in many aspects of our lives when things were going on throughout the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, and as I mentioned, the ability to reflect, like you might reflect on those positive things and the growth, but you might also be able to reflect and say, okay, I now know that that's not my strength, or, you know, and so, you know, but that's knowledge. So there's growth there, right? Learning about yourself, that is growth.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Seeing any other comments at the moment?
Okay, that's no problem. Again, I hope people just take this information away and spend some time reflecting on their relationships, on their growth, on their experience. And then there's lots of tips there on how to, again, practice that self-care. I know people are a little tired of that, but it's so important. I don't know if we need to come up with a different word so people don't have a negative reaction to it, but it really is about, again, taking a pause and recognizing what do you need.
Absolutely. If anyone, aside from just commenting on the aspect that we touched on earlier, if you have any questions, we're at the end of the half hour, but we could fit in a couple questions, I'm sure, if there are any. And if not,
Absolutely.
that's be perfectly fine as well.
Yeah, and I can send over, like I said, Chad, I can send over the slides for this for the first and the second half, so that can be shared if anybody's interested. So whether they reach out to me or to you, that's fine, but I'd be happy to share.
Terrific. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so maybe we'll just look to close things up here. And I will mention that our next edition of the Booster Series is scheduled for May 16th, and it's entitled, "What is My Tendency?" And Carmel was telling me before we went on air that it'll be a fun session, and we certainly encourage everybody to take part in that. I added the link to register for that session in the chat. So if you're viewing this in the live group, you'll be able to find that in the chat section. Of course, it's also. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say it is a fun one because it reminds me a little bit of when people did any of those personality tests, right, where you learn a little bit about yourself, and then that information again you can take and understand yourself, but also understand other people that you're interacting with, whether it's in your personal life or your work life. So it is a bit of a fun one. So I hope you all join.
Great, looking forward to that one. So as I mentioned again, that one's on May 16th. Aside from that link there, if you're not viewing the live session, you can also find it on the health providers page on the Shared Health website. We have information on there. You look on the health providers page, and then you can go to the mental health and addictions booster sessions on that. So again, lots of different locations to find that, and we'll probably also be sending it out via the usual email channels as well. So again, just want to say thank you to Carmel for the presentation today, and thank you to everybody who joined us. Hope you all have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.